Hey everyone. I never thought I'd be here, sharing my life like this, but I guess this is where things have brought me. My name is Tim, and up until recently, I thought I had a pretty decent life. I'm 38, work in IT, and have been married to my wife Candy for 8 years. We have a pretty cozy home and no kids, just a dog named Moose, who's honestly been my best buddy through all this. But life threw me a curveball I never saw coming. It all started a couple of months ago. Candy told me she was going on a camping trip with Jake, my boss. It wasn't weird at first. Jake is one of those outdoorsy types who's always organizing team bonding stuff. I wasn't too worried because, well, I trusted her. She made it sound like it was all above board, with a few other people from work joining. She even laughed when I joked about her roughing it in the woods, saying, "You know me, Tim, I can barely survive without a hairdryer." But when she got back, something felt off. She was distant, glued to her phone more than usual, and avoided eye contact when we talked. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe she was just tired from the trip. But then I found something that shattered my peace, a pair of men's socks in the laundry that definitely weren't mine. I confronted Candy right away, holding up the socks like some crime scene evidence. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She barely glanced at them before shrugging. "Oh, those must be Jake's. We swapped some gear by mistake." Her voice was steady, but something about the way she said it made my gut tighten. I let it go, for the moment. Over the next few days, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Candy's late-night work meetings seemed more frequent, and she was always texting someone with a smirk she tried to hide. I knew I needed answers. That's when I decided to take a step I never thought I'd take. I called a divorce attorney, not to file anything yet, just to get some advice. The attorney listened to my suspicions and suggested hiring a private investigator. That's how I met Marvin, a straight-shooting, no-nonsense kind of guy who'd seen it all. He suggested using a tracking app and audio recorders, just to confirm if my gut feeling had any merit. I didn't feel great about spying on my own wife, but Marvin said something that stuck with me. "If you're wrong, you'll have peace of mind. If you're right, you'll have the truth." And honestly, I needed one or the other. I didn't know then how far down the rabbit hole this was going to take me, so after my meeting with Marvin, I went home with a mix of guilt and determination. Installing the tracking app was surprisingly easy, but it felt wrong, you know? Like I was crossing some invisible line. But every time I saw Candy giggle at her phone or brush off my questions about her day, I reminded myself that I wasn't doing this for nothing. I needed to know. About a week later, Candy told me she'd picked up a side gig. Apparently, Jake was hosting a big party, and she was going to be a waitress for the night. That hit me as odd. Candy isn't the side gig type. She always complained about standing too long or lifting anything heavier than her wine glass. But when I asked why, she just said, "Oh, it's a favor for Jake. He's been so generous with your career, Tim. Plus, the tips will be amazing." Generous with my career? What was that supposed to mean? I wanted to push further, but the way she said it, all sweet and innocent, made me feel like I'd be the bad guy for doubting her. That night, she got dolled up like I hadn't seen in years. Her dress wasn't exactly waitress attire, tight, low-cut, something you'd wear to a club, not to serve drinks. Moose even gave her a curious look, and for once, I wished the dog could talk. She gave me a quick kiss and breezed out the door, leaving me with a weird feeling in my chest. I pulled up the tracking app as soon as she left. Sure enough, her car headed straight to Jake's neighborhood. That part wasn't a surprise. But what did catch my attention was how long she stayed. Midnight turned into 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. By 3 a.m., I was pacing the living room, wondering if I should call her or just sit tight. She finally came home around 4 a.m., her hair messy and makeup smudged. She smelled like alcohol and perfume, not her usual kind either. "How was it?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She gave me a tired smile. "Exhausting. Rich people are the worst tippers. I'm going to bed." And just like that, she disappeared upstairs. I checked the app again after she fell asleep. Her location had stayed at Jake's house the entire time. No other stops, no detours. Maybe it was innocent after all. But then again, maybe it wasn't. I needed more than just dots on a map. I needed proof. The morning after Candy's waitressing gig, I couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. She spent most of the day in bed, claiming she was exhausted, which left me alone with my thoughts and the tracking app. I sent Marvin a quick text, updating him on the situation. He promised to look into it and said he'd keep me posted. A few days later, Marvin called. His tone was unusually serious. "Tim, we need to meet." That afternoon, we sat in his office while he slid a manila folder across the desk. "I followed up on the party," he said. "Your wife wasn't exactly serving hors d'oeuvres." My stomach dropped as I opened the folder. Inside were photos, grainy, but clear enough to see what was happening. There was Candy, draped over Jake's shoulder, laughing like she didn't have a care in the world. Another shot showed her in a corner with a group of men, one hand holding a drink, the other resting on someone's chest. My blood ran cold. The worst picture, though, was the one that followed. It showed Candy leaving Jake's house in the early hours, clinging to his arm like they were high school sweethearts. She wasn't the only one. 2 other men from Jake's company were in the frame, laughing as they headed to their cars. These weren't just co-workers. They were guys I'd had beers with, trusted, even considered friends. Marvin gave me a moment to process. "This is just the tip of the iceberg, Tim. I had some audio pulled from the house that night." He handed me a USB drive. "You might want to listen to this when you're alone. It'll confirm what you're already thinking." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to scream, to smash something, to do anything but sit there and feel this overwhelming sense of betrayal. Marvin must have seen it on my face because he leaned forward. "I'm sorry, man. But if you want to move forward, you need the full picture." I nodded numbly, clutching the folder and USB like they were evidence in some awful court case. "Thanks, Marvin. I'll let you know what I decide." Driving home, my mind raced. The Candy I thought I knew would never do this. Or had I been fooling myself all along? That night, while Candy slept, I plugged the USB into my laptop. What I heard made my stomach churn. Laughter, clinking glasses, and then Candy's voice, flirty, suggestive, unmistakably hers. The words weren't just casual banter, they were intimate, crossing every line I thought we'd drawn together. I closed the laptop, shaking with a mix of rage and heartbreak. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. This was a betrayal so deep it made me question everything about our life together. The next morning, I woke up early, despite barely sleeping. Candy was still in bed, sprawled out like nothing in the world could touch her. I stared at her for a moment, wondering how she could sleep so peacefully while my entire world felt like it was falling apart. Moose sat at my feet, sensing my unease, his big brown eyes staring up at me like he wanted to fix things. I spent the day in a haze, pretending everything was normal. Candy seemed fine, chipper even. She talked about going to the gym later and maybe meeting some girlfriends for lunch. I just nodded along, barely able to look at her. When she left, I texted Marvin. "I'm ready to confront her, but I need to do it right." His reply was quick: "Stay calm. Don't let emotions lead. Let her talk first." People reveal a lot when they're on the spot. It was good advice, but I didn't know if I could follow it. Every time I thought about the photos, the audio, and the lies, my blood boiled. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and angry all at once. But I had to keep it together, for my sake, if nothing else. That evening, Candy came home like it was any other day. She gave me a quick peck on the cheek and asked what I wanted for dinner. I decided to wait until after we ate. I didn't want to start something that might spiral out of control before I had the chance to hear her out, or corner her with the truth. Dinner was quiet. Too quiet. Candy asked if something was wrong, and I shrugged it off, blaming work stress. It wasn't entirely a lie. Once the dishes were done, I told her we needed to talk. Her expression shifted instantly. "What about?" she asked, her tone casual but guarded. I gestured toward the couch, and we sat down. My heart was pounding, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Candy, is there anything you need to tell me? Anything at all?" She tilted her head, confused, or pretending to be. "What do you mean?" I hesitated for a moment, then pulled out the folder Marvin had given me. I didn't say a word, just handed it to her. She opened it, and I watched her face closely. Her expression went from confusion to shock, then to something I couldn't quite place. Defiance, maybe. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You tell me," I replied, my tone cold. "Because I know you weren't just serving drinks at Jake's party." Her eyes darted to the photos again, then back to me. "You were spying on me?" "Don't try to flip this around," I snapped, my calm facade cracking. "I trusted you, Candy. And now I've got proof that you've been lying to me. So why don't you stop pretending and tell me the truth? Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for the right words, but none came. For the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. But even then, she didn't admit anything. Tim, it's not what it looks like. Oh really? I said, standing up. Because it looks like you've been sneaking around with my boss and God knows who else. So explain it to me, Candy. Make it make sense. She stared at me, her eyes welling up with tears. But I wasn't buying the act, not this time. It's complicated, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. Uncomplicate it, I shot back. And that's when she said the words that sent my world spiraling even further. It was just one night. I didn't mean for it to happen. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. Just one night. I repeated it, my voice hollow. That's what you're going with? Candy sat there, clutching the folder like it could somehow shield her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I wasn't feeling sympathy, just a growing storm of anger and betrayal. Tim, please, it was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice trembling. I clenched my fists, trying to keep control. With Jake? Or was it someone else too? Be honest, Candy, because I've got more than just these photos. Don't make me spell it all out. Her head shot up, her eyes wide. What do you mean? She asked, a flicker of fear crossing her face. I pulled out my phone and played one of the audio clips Marvin had given me. It was her voice, laughing, teasing, flirting. Then Jake's voice chimed in, low and suggestive. The implications were unmistakable. As the recording played, Candy covered her face with her hands, sobbing. Stop please, she cried. I'll tell you everything, Tim. Just stop. I paused the recording, my stomach churning. Then start talking, I said, my tone icy. I want the truth. All of it. Candy took a deep breath, her hands shaking. It was, after the camping trip, she began. Jake and I had too much to drink one night. It wasn't planned, Tim. I swear. It just happened. It just happened, I echoed, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Great excuse. Did it just happen at the party too? Because I've got photos that say otherwise. She shook her head, her tears flowing freely now. No, I mean yes, we were flirting at the party, but nothing happened that night. I didn't sleep with him again. I swear. I didn't believe her. Not after everything I'd seen and heard. And what about the other guys in those photos? You seem pretty cozy with them too. Her face turned pale. They're just co-workers, Tim. I didn't do anything with them. I scoffed. You didn't do anything? You expect me to believe that after you've lied to my face for weeks? You've made me doubt every word that comes out of your mouth. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Tim, please, I love you. I made a mistake, but I don't want to lose us. Her words only fueled my anger. You love me? Is that what love looks like to you? Sneaking around, lying, humiliating me. She flinched like I'd slapped her, but I didn't care. I stood up and paced the room, trying to gather my thoughts. Moose followed me, sensing the tension, his tail tucked low. I don't even know who you are anymore, Candy, I said finally. The woman I married wouldn't do this. She wouldn't destroy our life for, what? A fling? Attention? What was it worth to you? Candy sat there, silent, her tears soaking the photos she still held. She didn't have an answer, at least not one I could believe. The silence between us felt like a chasm. Candy sat on the couch, hugging her knees, her makeup smudged and her eyes red from crying. I leaned against the wall, my arms crossed, staring at her like she was a stranger. Tim, she finally whispered, I know I messed up. I don't even know why I did it. I felt invisible. Like we were stuck in a routine. Invisible. I snapped. You felt invisible, so your solution was to shack up with my boss? Do you even hear yourself? She winced but didn't look away. It wasn't about him. It was about me. I've been feeling lost. Like I'm not enough. Her words were like nails on a chalkboard. Not enough. I echoed. I've given you everything, Candy. A home, security, love. And you're telling me that wasn't enough for you. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but I wasn't about to let her play the victim. Do you know what you've done to me? To us? You didn't just betray me, you threw our entire life in the trash. She tried to reach for me again, but I stepped back, shaking my head. Don't. Just don't. There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens now, Tim? Are you going to leave me? I laughed bitterly. Leave you? You don't get to ask that. Not after what you've done. Her tears turned into sobs, but I didn't feel any pity. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow kind of anger, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel cold. I don't know what happens next, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. But I'll tell you this, I'm not going to sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened. You destroyed my trust, Candy. And I don't think you understand what that means. She didn't say anything, just buried her face in her hands. I turned and walked out of the room, Moose trailing behind me. I needed air, space, anything to clear my head. I ended up in the backyard, staring at the stars while the cool night air did little to calm me. Moose sat by my feet, leaning his head against my leg like he was trying to comfort me. I reached down and scratched behind his ears, my thoughts swirling. How had it come to this? How had the woman I once considered my soulmate turned into someone I couldn't even recognize? One thing was clear, the Candy I thought I knew was gone, and the life we had built together was teetering on the edge of collapse. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Moose whining by the door. I realized I had slept on the couch, still in the clothes I wore the night before. My body ached, but it was nothing compared to the heaviness in my chest. Candy's side of the bed stayed empty. Good. I wasn't ready to face her again. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. It was Marvin. I hesitated before answering. I wasn't sure I could handle more bad news, but I knew avoiding it wouldn't change anything. Marvin, I said, my voice rough. What's up? Got some updates, he said, his tone neutral but serious. You might want to sit down for this. I dropped into the recliner, Moose hopping up to rest his head on my lap. Just tell me. There's more to the story with Jake, Marvin began. But it's not just him. There are others. My stomach turned. Others? What do you mean? From what I've gathered, Jake's party wasn't just a party. It was more like a private event. Exclusive, if you get my drift. I didn't like where this was going. What are you saying, Marvin? He sighed. I'm saying your wife wasn't just hanging out with Jake. She was photographed with at least 2 other men, high-ranking guys from your company. This wasn't a mistake, Tim. It was deliberate. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, flashing through memories of Candy's recent behavior, the late nights, the secrecy. Are you sure? I asked, my voice barely audible. Positive, Marvin said. I've got names, photos, everything. These aren't just co-workers, Tim. These are guys you know. Friends, or so you thought. The room seemed to tilt. Send me everything, I managed to say. You got it. But listen, Tim, Marvin added, his voice softer now. This isn't just about what she did. It's about what you do next. You've got a choice here. I know it's hard, but you've got to start thinking about yourself. I ended the call and sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling. My phone buzzed again, Marvin's email with the promised evidence. I didn't open it right away. I couldn't. Just knowing it was there felt like enough to crush me. Eventually, I forced myself to look. The photos were damning. Candy laughing with another man, her hand on his arm, a private moment with Jake that looked anything but platonic. The timestamps matched the night of the party. I closed the email and stared at the screen. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a calculated, deliberate act. And the men involved? They weren't strangers. They were people I had trusted, people I had let into my life. I felt like a fool. Worse, I felt like a stranger in my own life. After Marvin's call and the photos, I knew I couldn't avoid Candy forever. But before I could confront her again, something else landed in my lap. I opened my work email to catch up on a few things, trying to distract myself from the chaos at home. That's when I saw it, a message from Jake. The subject line read, Team Spirit and Professional Boundaries. I opened it, my hands trembling. The email was addressed to me and a few other employees, but the wording felt pointed, like it was meant specifically for me. It talked about the importance of maintaining professionalism and keeping personal matters separate from work. Jake even threw in a line about trust being the foundation of all successful relationships. The audacity made my blood boil. I read it twice, trying to decide if he was taunting me or just covering his tracks. Either way, it felt like a slap in the face. He was my boss, my supposed mentor. And now he was sending me corporate platitudes while stabbing me in the back. Without thinking, I hit reply. I typed out, "Do you really think you're fooling anyone, Jake? Or are you just trying to twist the knife a little deeper?" But I didn't send it. Not yet. Instead, I saved it as a draft and slammed the laptop shut. I wasn't ready to play that hand, not until I had a plan. Candy walked into the room not long after, her expression tentative. "Tim, can we talk?" she asked softly. I didn't look at her. "About what, Candy? What part of this mess do you want to discuss first?" She sighed and sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I know you're hurt. I know I've broken your trust. But I want to fix this. Fix this." I laughed bitterly. "How do you plan to do that, exactly? Undo what you did? Rewrite the past?" "No, but I can work to make things right moving forward," she said, her voice trembling. "We can go to counseling. We can start over." "Start over," I repeated, shaking my head. "Do you even hear yourself? Candy, I don't know if I can even look at you the same way, let alone trust you again. And Jake? The others? Do you think I can just walk into work and act like nothing happened?" Tears filled her eyes, but this time they didn't move me. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what else to say." "That's the problem," I said, standing up. "You don't know what to say because there's nothing you can say. Words aren't enough, Candy. Not this time." I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" she called after me. "Out," I said flatly. "Don't wait up." I didn't have a plan when I left the house. I just needed to get away, to clear my head. Driving aimlessly through town, I eventually ended up at a bar I hadn't been to in years. It was the kind of place where nobody asked questions, and that's exactly what I needed. I slid onto a stool and ordered a whiskey neat. The bartender, an older guy with a gruff demeanor, poured it without a word. I stared into the glass, thinking about how my life had unraveled in just a few weeks. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's nightmare play out. "Rough day?" the bartender finally asked, breaking the silence. "You could say that," I muttered. He nodded knowingly but didn't push for details. "Well, whatever it is, it ain't the first, and it won't be the last. Just take it one step at a time." I let out a bitter laugh. One step at a time sounded like a cruel joke when my entire world was in shambles. But maybe he was right. Maybe I needed to stop thinking about the big picture and focus on what I could do right now. By the second drink, I had made up my mind. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I needed to take control, for my own sanity. That meant two things. First, I had to confront Jake. Not at work, not through an email, but face to face. He needed to know that I wasn't some pushover he could manipulate. And second, I had to figure out what to do about Candy. Whether it meant counseling, separation, or something more permanent, I couldn't keep living in this limbo. The thought of leaving her felt like a punch to the gut, but staying felt even worse. As I finished my drink, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Marvin. "Let me know when you want to move forward with the next steps. I've got everything ready." I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back, "Tomorrow. Let's do it." The next morning, I woke up feeling clearer than I had in weeks. The path ahead wasn't easy, but at least I had a plan. It was time to stop being the victim and start taking action. The following day, I called Marvin and told him I wanted everything he had on Jake. Names, dates, photos, anything that would give me leverage. I wasn't planning to go nuclear, at least not yet, but I needed something to back me up if things got ugly. Marvin didn't disappoint. By noon, I had a neatly organized file with all the dirt on Jake and his so-called exclusive parties. I didn't give myself time to overthink it. I drove straight to Jake's office, my mind racing but my resolve steady. When his secretary asked if I had an appointment, I lied and said Jake was expecting me. Before she could question it, I pushed open the door to his office and walked in. Jake looked up from his desk, surprised but not rattled. "Tim," he said, leaning back in his chair. "This is unexpected. What can I do for you?" I shut the door behind me and took a seat without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk," I said, my tone firm. His smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I didn't waste time. I pulled out the folder Marvin had given me and tossed it onto his desk. Jake glanced at it, then back at me, his expression unreadable. "Go ahead," I said. "Open it. I think you'll find it enlightening." Jake hesitated before flipping it open. As he skimmed the contents, the color drained from his face. He closed the folder and leaned forward, his voice low. "Where did you get this?" "That's not the question you should be asking," I replied. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" He tried to regain his composure, but I could see the cracks forming. "Look, Tim, I don't know what you think you've found, but—" "Cut the crap," I snapped, cutting him off. "I know what you've been doing, Jake. With my wife. With others. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." For a moment, he said nothing, his jaw tightening. Then he leaned back, his demeanor shifting from defensive to smug. "All right, let's say you're right. What's your play here, Tim? You want to ruin me? Go ahead. But think about what that means for you." His words hung in the air, a veiled threat that only fueled my anger. "I'm not here to play games, Jake. I came to give you a chance to own up to what you've done. To my wife. To me. If you think I'm bluffing, try me." Jake stared at me, his smirk fading. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "All right," he said finally, his tone colder. "What do you want?" "I want you to stay the hell away from my wife." "From my life," I said, my voice steady despite the rage bubbling beneath the surface. "And if I hear so much as a whisper of your name near her again, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you've been up to." He nodded slowly, his hands clasped tightly on the desk. "Fine. You've made your point." I stood up, my chest heaving as I fought to keep my emotions in check. "Good. Remember this moment, Jake. Because I won't give you another warning." Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving him to stew in the mess he'd made. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel on the drive home, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a small spark of control returning to my life. When I got home, I half expected Candy to be waiting with some new excuse or half-hearted attempt at reconciliation. But the house was quiet. Moose greeted me at the door, tail wagging, but Candy was nowhere in sight. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I found her in the kitchen, staring blankly at her phone. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and puffy. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice small. "I went to see Jake," I said, grabbing a glass of water and leaning against the counter. Her face paled. "Tim, what did you do?" "Nothing," I said, my tone sharp. "Yet. But he knows I'm not some idiot he can walk all over." Candy swallowed hard, setting her phone down. "Tim, I didn't want this to happen. I swear. Save it," I interrupted. "I'm done listening to excuses, Candy. You've lied to me, humiliated me, and dragged our marriage through the mud. Do you even understand what you've done?" She flinched at my words, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know I messed up. But I love you, Tim. I do. Love." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you loved the attention more than you ever loved me." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't feel any pity. "Not anymore. I went to Jake because I needed to draw a line, Candy. Not for us, for me. I needed him to know that I'm not going to let him or anyone else destroy my life." Candy wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. "Tim, please. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Counseling, therapy, anything. Just, don't give up on us." I stared at her, the woman I had once vowed to love and cherish, and felt nothing but a hollow ache. "I don't even know if there's an us to save anymore," I said quietly. Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, sobbing into her hands. Moose patted over and rested his head on her lap, his eyes darting between us like he was trying to understand. I turned and left the room, heading upstairs to the guest bedroom. It was becoming my new sanctuary, a place where I could shut the door and pretend for a few hours that my world wasn't falling apart. Later that night, I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to my divorce attorney. I hadn't made any final decisions yet, but I needed to know my options. Candy had thrown out the word therapy like it was some magic fix, but trust couldn't be rebuilt with a few counseling sessions. And even if I somehow forgave her, how could I ever forget? As I typed, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Marvin. "I've got more info on Jake's connections. Let me know if you want to dig deeper." I stared at the message for a long time before replying, "Not yet. Let me handle things on my end first." Closing the laptop, I leaned back in the chair, exhaustion washing over me. The road ahead felt uncertain, but one thing was clear: I couldn't keep living in limbo. Whether it meant rebuilding or walking away, I had to make a choice. And soon the next morning, I woke up in the guest bedroom, Moose sprawled across my feet like a warm, furry anchor. The night's rest had done little to clear my head, but at least I wasn't running on empty anymore. As I padded downstairs, I found Candy sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of coffee. She didn't look up as I walked past. I poured myself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching her. "Have you thought about what you're going to do, Candy?" I asked, breaking the silence. She flinched like my words physically hurt her. "I don't know what you want me to say, Tim," she replied, her voice hoarse. "I'm trying, but I feel like no matter what I do, it won't be enough." "That's because it won't," I said bluntly. "Not right now. Not without honesty. I can't even consider moving forward until I know the whole truth." Candy's hands gripped the coffee mug tightly, her knuckles turning white. "I've told you everything," I scoffed. "Have you?" Because Marvin uncovered some interesting things. Like the fact that Jake wasn't the only one at those parties. Or that this wasn't just a one-night mistake. Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might pass out. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Candy," I snapped, pulling out my phone and opening the folder Marvin had sent me. I turned the screen toward her, showing a photo of her with another man, someone I vaguely recognized from company events. "This guy ring any bells?" She stared at the screen, her eyes wide with shock, or maybe guilt. That's Paul," she stammered. "We didn't do anything. He's a friend of Jake's." "A friend?" I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what we're calling it now? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot more than friendly." Candy buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't want this, Tim. I swear I didn't." "Then why?" I demanded. "Why did you let it happen? Why did you keep going back?" Her sobs grew louder, but I pressed on. "I need answers, Candy. Real ones. If you want even the slightest chance at fixing this, you have to stop lying." She lifted her head, tears streaming down her face. "It was Jake," she whispered. He introduced me to them. He said it was just for fun, just harmless flirting at first. And then, it got out of hand." My stomach turned. "You're telling me Jake pressured you into this?" She nodded, her hands trembling. "At first, I thought it was harmless. A way to network, to be part of his world. But it wasn't. It was darker. And by the time I realized it, I was in too deep." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. If this was true, it wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was manipulation, exploitation, maybe even something worse. But could I trust her words after all the lies? And the others? I asked. Were they part of this networking too? Candy hesitated, then nodded again. "Some of them, yes. But not everyone. I didn't do everything they wanted. I swear." The room felt like it was spinning. This was bigger than I had imagined, and I didn't know if I had the strength to face it. Candy's confession left me reeling. I sat down across from her, the coffee in my mug untouched and growing cold. "So let me get this straight," I said slowly, trying to make sense of it all. "Jake brings you to these parties, introduces you to these men, and, what? You go along with it because you think it'll help his career." She shook her head frantically. "It wasn't like that, Tim. At least, not at first. Jake made it seem like I was just being part of the team, like it was a favor to him. I didn't realize." "Didn't realize what?" I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "That you were being used? Or that you were crossing lines you couldn't come back from?" Her lips trembled, but she didn't answer. I could tell there was more she wasn't saying, and I wasn't about to let her off the hook. "Candy, if you want any chance of fixing this, you need to tell me everything. Right now. No more half-truths." Her shoulders slumped, and she finally looked me in the eye. "It wasn't just Jake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "There were others, other men at those parties. They treated it like a game. And I let it happen. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut." "Why, Candy?" My voice cracked, a mix of anger and heartbreak. Why would you let them do this to you, to us? She wiped at her tears, her hands shaking. Because I felt powerless. Jake had so much control over you, over me. He made it clear that if I didn't play along, it could hurt your career. I didn't want to risk that, Tim. I didn't want to ruin everything we've built. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. On one hand, I wanted to believe her, to see her as a victim in all this. But on the other, I couldn't ignore the choices she'd made, the lies she'd told, and the damage she'd done. This isn't just about me, Candy, I said, my voice low and cold. You didn't just betray our marriage, you betrayed yourself. And now, you're trying to make it sound like it was out of your control. But you had a choice. You always had a choice. She nodded, her tears falling freely now. I know, Tim. I know I made the wrong choices. And I hate myself for it. But please, don't give up on me. Don't give up on us. I stood up, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. I need time, I said, turning toward the door. And space. Don't expect me to just snap my fingers and forgive you, Candy. It doesn't work like that. I left the kitchen and walked outside, the crisp air biting against my skin. Moose followed me, his tail wagging cautiously, like he could sense my turmoil. I sat on the steps, staring out at the yard while the weight of everything settled on my shoulders. Jake. The parties. The others. Candy's choices. It was too much, and I didn't know how to process it all. One thing was clear, this wasn't just a marital issue anymore. It was something deeper, darker. And I couldn't face it alone. Sitting on the steps of our back porch, I stared at the horizon while Moose rested his head on my knee. The air felt heavy, like the weight of everything I'd learned had somehow seeped into the atmosphere. I couldn't shake Candy's words, how she'd felt powerless, how she'd been caught in something bigger than herself. But was it true? Or just another excuse? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos Marvin had sent. The faces blurred together, Jake, Paul, and the others I recognized from company events. It was like peeling back layers of a life I thought I understood, only to find rot underneath. Each photo was a reminder that these weren't strangers. These were people I'd shaken hands with, laughed with, trusted. The anger simmered beneath the surface, mixing with confusion and hurt. How had I been so blind? How had Candy fallen so far without me noticing? I had questions, so many questions, but the one that kept gnawing at me was, what kind of man does this to another? Jake wasn't just my boss. He was someone I'd admired, until now. I didn't want to go back inside, not yet. The thought of facing Candy again made my stomach churn. I needed clarity, and there was only one person who could give it to me. By early afternoon, I was standing outside Marvin's office. When I walked in, he gave me a quick nod, gesturing for me to sit. I was wondering when you dropped by, he said, sliding a folder across the desk. There's more. My jaw tightened as I opened the folder. Inside were detailed reports, text logs, and more photos, some I hadn't seen before. One in particular made my blood run cold. Jake, Candy, and another man sitting in a dimly lit room, drinks in hand, their body language far too intimate for comfort. What is this? I asked, my voice low but sharp. From what I've pieced together, Jake's parties weren't just social gatherings, Marvin explained. They were more exclusive. A mix of networking and indulgence. The kind of thing where people let their guard down, and boundaries don't seem to exist. I flipped through the pages, each one revealing more about the twisted dynamics at play. Candy wasn't the only woman involved. There were others, wives, girlfriends, employees, all tangled in a web Jake had spun. Did Candy do this willingly? I asked, struggling to get the words out. Marvin hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It's complicated. From what I've uncovered, Jake has a way of making people feel like they don't have a choice. He dangles opportunities, uses leverage. For some, it's about ambition. For others, fear. I leaned back in the chair, the weight of his words settling over me. Candy's claim of feeling powerless suddenly seemed more plausible. But it didn't absolve her. She still made choices, choices that hurt me, choices that destroyed our marriage. What about the other men? I asked, my voice steadier now. Paul, the others in the photos. Were they in on it? Marvin nodded grimly. Some of them, yes. Jake runs a tight circle. They protect each other. But not all of them are as deep in as he is. I clenched my fists, the anger bubbling up again. This wasn't just about Candy anymore. It was about Jake, his power, and the way he used it to manipulate people. And it wasn't just me who had been affected. This was bigger, much bigger. Tim, Marvin said, pulling me out of my thoughts. You need to think carefully about your next move. If you go after Jake, it's not going to be clean. He's got connections, resources. But if you want to pursue this, I'll back you all the way. I stared at the folder, my mind racing. I wanted to bring Jake down, to expose him for what he truly was. But at what cost? My career? My sanity? My life? I need time to think, I said finally, standing up. But thanks, Marvin. For everything. Take your time, he said. But don't wait too long. Guys like Jake don't stop unless someone makes them. When I got home, Candy was in the living room, pacing nervously. She stopped when she saw me, her face pale and anxious. Where were you? She asked. With Marvin, I replied bluntly. Getting more answers. Her shoulders sagged, and she sank into the couch. Tim, Don't, I said, holding up a hand. I've heard enough for now. I'm not ready to talk about this with you yet. She looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I went upstairs, leaving her alone with her guilt and my silence. That night, I sat in the guest room, staring at the folder Marvin had given me. The evidence inside could ruin Jake, but it could also drag me and Candy into a storm I wasn't sure we'd survive. Moose curled up beside me, his steady breathing a small comfort in the chaos. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel something other than anger, grief. Grief for the life I thought I had, for the woman I thought Candy was, for the trust that had been shattered. As the hours ticked by, I realized I had to make a choice. This wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about finding a way forward, whether that meant rebuilding or walking away. And either way, it was going to change everything. By morning, the decision was clear. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between rage and heartbreak, stuck in a limbo of unanswered questions and shattered trust. I needed to act, not just for my sanity but for my future. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. Found Candy in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She looked up when I entered, her eyes hollow and tired. I could see the weight of guilt hanging over her, but it didn't soften my resolve. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady. She nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I know. I sat down across from her, the folder from Marvin in my lap. I didn't open it, I didn't need to. Candy, I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us. About everything that's happened. Tears welled in her eyes, but I held up a hand before she could speak. This isn't just about what you did. It's about what I can live with. And the truth is, I can't move past this. Not completely. Not in a way that lets us be the people we used to be. She started to cry softly, but I pressed on. I've tried to understand, to find some way to see you as the woman I married. But every time I look at you, I see the lies, the betrayal, and the choices you made. I don't hate you, Candy. But I can't trust you. And without trust, there's nothing left. Her sobs grew louder, but I stayed calm. I've spoken to an attorney. I'll be filing for divorce. You'll get your fair share, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. But it's over. Candy buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with grief. I felt a pang of sadness, but no regret. This was the only way forward. Later that day, I called Marvin. I'm ready, I told him. Let's do it. Marvin didn't need an explanation. Over the next few days, we gathered everything we had on Jake and compiled it into a damning package. Evidence of his manipulation, his predatory behavior, and the tangled web of deceit he'd woven around so many people, including me and Candy. We sent the file anonymously to the company's HR department, the board of directors, and for good measure, a prominent local journalist. Marvin assured me it was airtight. If Jake thought he was untouchable, he was about to learn otherwise. Within a week, the fallout began. Jake was placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation. The whispers around the office turned into a roar as people pieced together what had been happening behind closed doors. A few of the men involved tried to defend Jake, but the evidence was too damning. One by one, they distanced themselves, leaving him to face the music alone. The house felt quieter after Candy left. She packed her things and moved in with her sister while the divorce papers were finalized. Moose and I stayed in the house, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like I could breathe again. The loneliness was hard, but it was better than the constant tension. I started seeing a therapist, someone Marvin recommended, to help me process everything. It wasn't easy, but each session felt like a small step toward healing. I also reached out to a few close friends, people I had distanced myself from during the chaos. Their support reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I could rebuild my life even after everything had fallen apart. The investigation into Jake culminated in his termination. The local journalist ran an expose that detailed the toxic culture he'd fostered and the harm he'd caused. His name became synonymous with scandal, and his career crumbled. It didn't fix everything, but it felt like justice. Months later, I stood in the backyard with Moose, watching the sunset. The past few months had been some of the hardest of my life, but they'd also taught me something important. I was stronger than I thought. The pain of Candy's betrayal still lingered, but it didn't define me. I was learning to let go, not just of her but of the anger, the bitterness, and the need to understand why. Some things couldn't be explained. Some wounds would never fully heal. But life went on. As Moose wagged his tail, nudging me with his nose, I smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to take the first step forward.